The Concorde is one of the most iconic planes of all time, as it was capable of traveling from New York to London in less than 3 hours. This supersonic jet with a max speed of 1,350 miles per hour was the pinnacle of rapid point-to-point travel for businessmen and celebrities. But, as we all know, the Concorde is no longer with us. A popular misconception is that soon after an Air France Concorde crashed in July of 2000, the plane was grounded, and that safety concerns led to the Concorde being permanently retired a few years later. Now, a crash that claimed the lives of 113 people is no laughing matter. But for a plane that had been in service for 24 years and made nearly 50,000 successful flights with British Airways alone, you would think that a single crash wouldn't hurt the reliability and safety record of the aircraft. I mean, just look at the Boeing 737 MAX, which is already back in the airs. So, why was the Concorde really scrapped? Taking a look back at the origins of the Concorde, we'll find ourselves within the depths of the Cold War in the mid-1960s. Britain and France wanted to develop a supersonic commercial airliner to make their lead in aircraft technology clear. At first, either country tried to accomplish this feat individually, but they soon ran into cost overruns and a shortage of manpower, so the British would seek out help. They started out by contacting a variety of US firms, but no US firm really wanted to work with the Bristol Aeroplane Company, as was funded by the British government. During the Cold War, sentiment against government funding was rather high, as it was associated with the socialist regime. US firms worried that working with the Bristol Aeroplane Company would undermine the American free market system, so the British had to look elsewhere, and it wouldn't be long till they teamed up with the French. Sud Aviation, which was the French company working on the supersonic jet, was still trying to build an engine that was powerful enough. The British, on the other hand, had already figured this out, which made them a desirable partner for the French. Both countries would end up splitting up the development and manufacturing process, and they would succeed in pumping out a flying prototype by the end of the 1960s. The countries hoped that by beating the US to commercial supersonic jets, they could build up a large lead within the market. Considering this, they expected to sell 350 Concordes by the end of the 1970s. Initial demand for the Concorde was actually quite strong despite its high cost. The aircraft ended up costing 6 times initial expectations, coming in at £23 million or about $177 million today, not to mention the exuberant fuel consumption. Nonetheless, by the end of 1969, the countries would have 74 orders on the books from 16 different airlines. Unfortunately though, this would end up being the peak of the Concorde. You see, in 1973, we would face the oil crisis, as the Arab countries would implement an oil embargo. This made it difficult for airlines to source fuel for their existing fleet, and even harder for them to sell these higher-priced tickets to customers. The oil crisis would also cause a massive stock market crash, and the US would experience massive amounts of inflation after ditching the gold standard. So, business leaders around the world were seeing their stock positions as well as their cash positions plummet in value. They were clearly not in the best position to be spending large amounts of money on speedy travel. Realizing this, all but 4 airlines would pull their Concorde orders by 1976. The remaining airlines included British Airways, Air France, Iran Air, and a Chinese airline. Once the Iranian Revolution broke out in 1978 though, Iran Air would pull their order and the Chinese airline would follow suit. Sure enough, only Air France and British Airways remained with a total of 14 orders. The countries hoped that as the world recovered from the downturn, interest for the Concorde would pick up, and this likely would have been the case. But the US would introduce a major plot twist in 1978 with the Airline Deregulation Act. Until 1978, the US government had limited the fares airlines could charge and the routes they could fly. So, the name of the game was not trying to offer the cheapest service possible like it is today. Rather, the goal was to offer as much as possible to customers for the standardized ticket price. In such an environment, the Concorde made perfect sense. Having the travel time was an indispensable luxury for many. But with the Deregulation Act, airlines no longer cared about providing the best or fastest experience. Their primary goal was offering the cheapest fares possible to reach as many people as they could. Airlines would switch over to the hub and spoke model to increase the efficiency of their operations, and as ticket prices came down, more and more regular people would start to fly. Considering this shift, it's no wonder why the Concorde was overlooked by airlines. I actually think that this was the primary reason that the Concorde failed. Sure, the plane was expensive and consumed a lot of fuel, but airlines can just pass over these costs to the customers. And when the economy is doing well and you only have 100 seats to fill, it wouldn't be too terribly difficult to fill up these planes on a regular basis. So, though the cost of the aircraft was a limiting factor, I don't think it was the key reason for the downfall. It simply made way more sense for airlines to go for the masses now that the floodgates were opened instead of focusing on this niche luxury market. What happened to the airlines that did purchase the Concorde though? Well, the French and British governments never made back their money as they simply weren't able to sell enough Concordes. However, Air France and British Airways were able to operate the Concorde profitably. Throughout the 1980s and 1990s, the Concorde was a no-brainer to many rich individuals. Ticket prices were only 20% higher than regular first-class tickets, but the travel time was cut in half. So, within this niche demographic, the Concorde was actually extremely successful. In 1986, for instance, Air France made $8.8 million in profit from the Concorde, and British Airways made $17.3 million. By the time the Concorde was retired, British Airways had generated a total of £1.75 billion in revenue with £1 billion in operating costs. This means that they grossed about £750 million. Spreading that over the 50,000 flights they completed, you get approximately £15,000 in profit per flight. To put that in perspective, the average profit per passenger in the US is $17.75. With about 300 passengers on average, we get approximately $5,300 in profit per flight. So clearly, the Concorde was actually quite profitable. But given the low volume, it didn't really matter. If we spread the £750 million over 20 years, we get £37.5 million per year. While that is a nice amount, British Airways generally makes £1 to £2 billion per year. So the Concorde only accounted for a couple of percent of British Airways' total profit. And that brings us to the crash in 2000. On July 25, 2000, Air France Flight 4590 would catch fire during takeoff and crash into a nearby hotel, killing a total of 113 people. Air France would immediately ground all of their Concordes, as speculation grew that the crash was caused by a faulty repair to the jet's reverse thruster. British Airways would continue to fly their Concordes for the next couple of weeks, but they would ground their fleet in August as well. After an investigation was completed, it would be revealed that a piece of titanium was left behind on the runway by a Continental plane. This piece of titanium would puncture the tire of the Concorde and damage one of its fuel tanks. This would consequentially lead to a fire and the subsequent crash. Clearly, this was not the fault of the Concorde, but to be precautious, both Air France and British Airways would add bulletproof rubber lining to their fuel tanks and replace their tires with tougher Michelin tires. In the summer of 2001, both companies would announce their plans to resume Concorde flights in the fall of 2001. Unfortunately, we all know what would transpire on September 11, 2001. Ironically, the first Concorde operational assessment flight test would take place on September 11, 2001, just hours before the attack. After the attack, airline demand would fall off a cliff overnight. People were terrified of riding planes and avoided taking vacations and business trips if possible. The dot-com bubble was also in the process of bursting, and the attack simply accelerated the downfall of the stock market into 2002. So, not only was the overall economy performing poorly, but people were specifically avoiding air travel. This was especially true with the top businessmen and celebrities, who would be primary targets for hijackings. Despite this, both Air France and British Airways would bring back the Concorde as promised. But, given the context of the return, the Concorde was no longer profitable. Moreover, either company was losing money on every single flight in general. So, when the need to cut costs came up, the niche Concorde was of course the first on the chopping block. In hindsight, this was actually a pretty good time to cut the Concorde. As the economy recovered after the dot-com bubble, we would quickly head into the Great Financial Recession, which was much more damaging. Unlike the dot-com bubble, which was simply fueled by extreme enthusiasm, followed by a return to reality, the 2008 financial recession was caused by major internal issues with financial institutions. So, from a business perspective, it's a good thing that the companies were able to retire the Concorde before the Great Recession. At the end of the day, more than anything, it seemed like the greatest hindrance for the Concorde was simply circumstance. It originally came out right before the 1973 oil crisis, and right after the oil crisis, we saw a radical shift towards cheaper tickets. Surprisingly, Air France and British Airways were able to work through this and make the Concorde profitable anyway. Unfortunately though, a tragic accident followed by a worldwide downturn in air travel sealed the fate for the Concorde, preventing it from reaching the heights it was designed to reach. Do you guys wish the Concorde was still around? Comment that down below. Also, drop a like if you guys think the Concorde deserved a better chance at success. And of course, consider joining our Discord community to suggest future video ideas, and consider subscribing to see more questions logically answered. But until then, I'm Ari, and I'll see you guys on the next one.